August 17, 1942, just 2 days before the raid. The English coast was cold that morning, though it was August. A sharp wind blew in from the sea, carrying with it the kind of silence soldiers grew used to before something terrible. Private Alan Cooper stood near the edge of the cliffs at New Haven Harbour, staring out into the fog-covered waters. He was just 22, a farm boy from Saskatchewan, Canada. But he wasn't a boy anymore. Not after what he'd seen in the past 6 months. Not after what was coming. He lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. Around him, dozens of men moved like ghosts, checking equipment, loading supplies, some praying, others just staring. The command had been given in whispers: Operation Jubilee, a raid on the German-occupied port of Dieppe, France. They said it would be quick, just a few hours, in and out. But Alan had heard that before. And war had a way of lying through smiling officers and well-dressed generals. Captain Reed walked past, his face hard, unreadable. He was one of the few British officers the Canadians actually liked. He didn't talk much, but he didn't have to. He fought beside them, slept in the dirt like them, and didn't pretend war was anything but hell. "Cooper," Reed said, stopping just beside him. "Sir, you ready?" Alan nodded slowly. "As ready as anyone, I guess." Reed looked out at the sea. "It's not going to be easy. Intelligence says the beach is lightly defended, but I don't trust intelligence anymore." Alan gave a dry chuckle. "Neither do I." They both stood there for a moment, neither speaking. Then Reed walked on, leaving Alan alone with the sound of waves and the growing weight in his chest. That night, under the cover of darkness, the soldiers loaded onto the landing crafts. The sea was rough, and many got sick. Alan kept his head down, the leather strap of his helmet biting into his chin. He tried to think of home, his mother's cooking, the way the sun hit the fields in late summer, but all he could see was the beach ahead, and the shadows waiting on it. By early morning, just before dawn on August 19th, 1942, the first boats began to close in on Dieppe. That's when everything went wrong. The Germans weren't sleeping. They weren't unprepared. They were waiting. The sound of machine gun fire ripped through the air like tearing metal. Men began dropping before they even hit the shore. Alan's boat was just seconds from the beach when a shell exploded nearby, sending water and blood spraying into the sky. He hit the ground hard when they landed, pebbles digging into his elbows, bullets zipping past his head. Around him, screams filled the air. Some were wounded, others dying. The tide turned red almost immediately. The tanks that were supposed to support them were stuck, unable to get up the pebbled beach. Their treads couldn't grip. Alan watched as one tank burst into flames, its hatch sealed. "No one got out. Move! Move up the beach!" someone shouted, but where? There was no cover. Just open ground and machine guns on the cliffs above. Alan crawled, dug, clawed forward. His rifle was useless. No targets, just shadows in windows, flashes from guns. He fired anyway, mostly to stay sane. Hours passed like minutes. Time stopped making sense. Radios went silent. Orders were screamed, ignored, repeated, lost. By noon, the beach was a graveyard. The order came to retreat to what was left of the force. Alan, bloody and half-blind from smoke and sweat, stumbled back toward the water. Boats were burning. Some had turned around. Others never made it. He found a wounded soldier, Corporal Mills, face pale and leg torn open. "I'm not leaving you," Alan said, lifting him up, step by step, toward a rescue boat. He didn't know how they made it, only that somehow they did. When the boats finally pulled away from Dieppe, Alan looked back, and all he could think was, we were never supposed to win this. The sea was cruel on the way back. The waves rocked what remained of the landing crafts like drunken beasts, tossing the wounded from side to side. Alan sat hunched over beside Corporal Mills, who had passed out from blood loss. Alan's arms were streaked with dried blood, some his, most not. His ears still rang from the sound of endless gunfire. And even now, as the French coast faded into mist behind them, he couldn't stop shaking. No one spoke, not even the officers. It wasn't victory. Everyone knew that. Hell, it wasn't even survival. It was an escape, a shameful broken retreat. Someone vomited near the stern. Another man started sobbing quietly, whispering someone's name over and over again. Alan didn't know who. There were too many names to remember, and most of them were gone now. His unit had gone in 128 men strong. He counted 37 getting on the boats. Only 17 made it back alive, and those who did weren't whole. Back at New Haven, the silence didn't lift. Command was there, of course. Brass with polished boots and pressed uniforms, pretending to look concerned. One of them stepped up as Alan and a few others climbed down from the boat. His face was hard like stone, but his eyes couldn't meet theirs. Debriefing in 1 hour. Medics will assist you in the meantime. That was it. No thank you. No apology. No explanation, just orders. Alan turned to them, voice low. You want a debriefing? Here's one. We got slaughtered. The officer flinched slightly but said nothing. Alan didn't care. The medical tent smelled of blood and iodine. He lay on a cot next to Mills, who hadn't regained consciousness. Nurses moved between beds, doing their best, but even they looked pale, shell-shocked, as if the blood had soaked into their bones. A nurse touched Alan's shoulder. You need stitches. I need a drink, he muttered. She gave him a tired look. Don't we all? Hours passed. Maybe more. Time had become strange, like it didn't move in a straight line anymore. Alan kept replaying the same scenes in his head. The beach, the tank stuck, the screams, and that look in Captain Reed's eyes before they landed. Like he knew, that thought stuck with him. He knew. That night after midnight, Alan slipped out of the medical tent. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't stay still. He walked past rows of dark tents, past the vehicles, past the watchmen who were too tired or too broken to stop him. Near the docks, he found a cigarette glowing in the dark. Captain Reed, sitting alone on a crate, staring out into the black water. A bottle beside him. He didn't look up when Alan approached. Alan stood there a moment, then sat down beside him. I thought we were the good guys, he said quietly. Reed finally looked at him. Eyes red, voice raw. We are. But sometimes the good guys bleed first. There was a long silence between them. Then Alan spoke again. Did you know that it was going to be like that? Reed exhaled slowly, then took a swig from the bottle. I had a feeling. Intel was sloppy. The timing was wrong. No aerial surprise. And those beaches, who the hell thought landing tanks on shingle would work? He shook his head bitterly. We were the test, Alan said. Reed didn't argue. They wanted to see what would happen. Reed's voice was almost a whisper. They wanted to learn how to invade France, how to hit the coast, what mistakes not to make. They just didn't say we'd be the ones paying for the lesson. Alan stared at the sea, jaw tight. So we were the sacrifice, Reed nodded. And it worked. God help us. It worked. It would take months before the full report came out. Before the Allies would admit, even to themselves, that Dieppe had been a disaster. But a necessary one. A brutal, bloody rehearsal for something far greater D-Day Normandy. The real invasion. But for the men who had lived through Dieppe, that was little comfort. Because no one built statues for practice runs, and no one ever told their mothers that their sons had died for a mistake. 3 days after Dieppe, the funerals began, except there were no coffins, no cemeteries, no flags folded neatly in mothers' arms. There were just names. Names of the missing, names of the dead. Some were confirmed. Most weren't. Alan sat in the edge of the camp chapel, staring at a list tacked to the wall. Handwritten, sloppy, ink smudged from weather or tears, probably both. He found his name halfway down. Cooper, A. Missing. Presumed KIA. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He was standing right there, alive, breathing, and they'd already buried him on paper. Just like that. Just a name in a growing pile of ghosts. Corporal Mills had died the day before, internal bleeding. The medics did their best, but there was only so much anyone could do when the system itself was broken. They didn't tell Alan until the morning after. Just another soft voice, another hand on the shoulder, another sentence he'd never forget. He didn't suffer. He just slipped away. They always said that. But they didn't know. They weren't the ones dragging, screaming. Bodies across burning beaches. Alan didn't cry. Not because he didn't want to, because he couldn't. The war had taken that from him already. He spent the next few days in silence, wandering the edges of the camp, avoiding debriefings, ignoring orders, saying just enough to stay out of the brig. No one pushed him. The officers knew better now. The Dieppe survivors weren't soldiers anymore. They were something else. Broken, burnt, brittle. Time bombs with cracked smiles and twitching hands. But the real betrayal came when the newspapers arrived. Alan read the headlines while sitting on a bench outside the mess hall. One of the clerks had left a copy of the Daily Telegraph lying open. Allied forces stage bold raid on French coast. Strategic success, despite casualties. Bold, strategic success. He read it again. Then he tore the paper in half, then in quarters, then in shreds, and still, it wasn't enough to quiet the scream in his throat. Later that day, Captain Reed found him behind the barracks, sharpening a bayonet with the kind of dead focus only grief could give. Reed didn't speak right away, just stood there, arms folded, watching the sparks fly off the blade. "They're saying it was worth it," Alan muttered after a while. "I know," Reed replied quietly. "They're calling us heroes, but they never saw the beach, never saw the blood." Reed sat down beside him, hands clasped. "They don't want the truth. Not yet, not until it's useful." Alan turned to him, eyes burning. "And what if it never is?" Reed didn't answer. Maybe he didn't know, or maybe he did, and the truth was worse than silence. Word was spreading fast. The higher-ups were already working on the narrative. Valuable lessons learned. That was the phrase making its rounds. Dieppe had been the rehearsal. Normandy would be the main event. They needed to test the beaches, the defenses, German response times, Reed said, voice low. They needed to see if air cover could make a difference, if tanks could land on open shores, if surprise was even possible anymore. And they used us to find out. Reed nodded. Someone had to. Alan stood, gripping the bayonet tighter. Then let them use someone else next time. Reed didn't argue. He just looked at the gravel beneath his boots. His silence said everything. They both knew no one else would be used. The next time would be bigger, deadlier, and they'd be called again. Before Alan walked away, Reed spoke one last time. "I requested your name be removed from the death list." Alan paused. "Thanks," he said. "But maybe you should have left it on." Then he walked back into the dying sun, unsure if he'd ever feel like a person again, or if Dieppe had turned him into something else forever. 2 weeks passed. But for Alan Cooper, time had lost its meaning. Each morning felt the same, the sting of cold air, the tasteless breakfast, the sound of boots on gravel. But under the surface something had shifted, not just in him, in everyone who came back from Dieppe. The survivors had begun to move like a pack, separate from the rest of the base, quieter, meaner, like men who had seen too much and been told it meant nothing. They weren't just haunted. They were angry. One night, as rain tapped gently on the canvas roof of the barracks, Alan sat alone, cleaning his rifle. It was an old habit, something that usually brought him peace. But tonight it just felt pointless. The metal gleamed under the lamplight, and for a moment he stared at it too long. Not with intent, just with thought. He didn't hear Sergeant Harlow come in. "You're being watched," the sergeant said plainly. Alan looked up. "By who?" "Command. Intel boys. They don't like how the Dieppe men are talking." Alan gave a humorless laugh. "Maybe they should have listened before sending us to get butchered." Sergeant Harlow didn't laugh. "They're afraid of morale collapsing," he said. "You start questioning the brass out loud, it spreads. Then no one follows orders. And if that happens, this whole war collapses before it hits the beaches of France." Alan stood up slowly. "So what are you saying? That I should shut up and play dead again?" "I'm saying be smart. You're already dead on paper. That makes you dangerous." Alan narrowed his eyes. "You were there. You saw what happened." "I did," Harlow said. "And that's why I'm telling you. Don't waste your life making noise that won't change a damn thing. Save it for when it matters." Alan didn't reply. He just stared at the floor until Harlow left. That night the barracks felt colder than usual. Not because of the rain, because of the silence. Because of the weight of things unsaid, 2 bunks over, someone finally broke it. We should have refused. Alan looked up. It was Carver, another Dieppe survivor. He'd taken shrapnel to the back and still walked with a limp. They sent us in blind, Carver continued, voice rising. No recon, no real air support, no way to retreat. They called it a raid, but it was suicide. A few men nodded. One spat on the floor, and now they say it was a success. Carver sneered. What kind of success leaves 900 men rotting on a beach? Alan stood quietly, not to argue, just to speak. No one's going to write the truth, not now. Not while it's still useful to lie. Silence again. Then Carver asked, so what do we do? Alan didn't have an answer, but the next day he found himself in the records room, standing in front of a steel cabinet marked OP, Jubilee, classified. The clerk, a young Brit barely out of school, looked up nervously. I need to see the full report, Alan said. I can't authorize that. Only officers of... Alan leaned in. I was there. I watched men get cut in half. You think I care about your paperwork? The clerk hesitated, then handed him a file. Alan opened it slowly. The first few pages were dry, tactical summaries, terrain assessments, objectives. Then came the notes. German resistance far stronger than anticipated. Air support miscoordinated. Failed to neutralize targets. Naval bombardment insufficient. Limited range due to timing. Then, one sentence made his chest tighten. High Command aware of potential failure. Raid intended as data-gathering operation for larger-scale invasion planning. It was right there. They knew. They sent them anyway. Alan closed the folder gently, like he was burying a body. His hands trembled, not from shock but rage. They hadn't just been sacrificed, they'd been used. Walking back to the barracks, Alan's mind raced. He could tell the others, publish the truth, leak it to the press, if he could find someone who'd listen. He wasn't sure what it would change, but maybe it would mean something. Maybe the dead could still speak if someone shouted loud enough and Alan Cooper was done being quiet. The next morning, Alan didn't show up for roll call. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was deliberate. He sat behind the mess hall with a notebook in hand, the stolen file still fresh in his mind, every word burned into memory. Page by page, he began writing it all down. Not just the facts from the report, but the truth they left out. The confusion on the beach, the screams, the betrayal in Captain Reed's eyes, the blood in the tide, the guilt that came home with the men who lived. He didn't write like a soldier. He wrote like a man who had been lied to. By the time the sun was high in the sky, he'd filled nearly 20 pages, and people noticed. Carver was the first to find him. He sat beside Alan without a word, watching the words pour onto the page. You writing a book? He finally asked. No, Alan said. A confession. Carver raised an eyebrow. Yours? No, theirs. By evening, word had spread. Other Dieppe survivors, bruised, bandaged, still limping, began stopping by. Some just stared at the notebook. Others asked to read it. A few cried while they did. Then someone said it. You should send this to someone. Alan looked up. Who? The press? Parliament? Hell, mail it to Churchill if you have to. Alan knew the risks. This wasn't a letter to his mother. It was a weapon. And in war, weapons pointed at the wrong people could get you buried in silence. Later that night, in a quiet corner of the barracks, Captain Reed appeared again. He looked older than he had a week ago. Or maybe Alan was just seeing him differently now. You planning something? Reed asked. Alan didn't lie. Yeah, Reed sighed, rubbed the bridge of his nose. I figured. Carver can't keep his mouth shut. I'm not doing this for attention, Alan said. I'm doing it because someone has to speak for the men we left behind. I know. Reed sat across from him, lowering his voice. But you need to be smart about it. You mean don't get caught? I mean don't get erased. Alan paused. You knew the plan was bad. You went along anyway. Reed looked at him sharply. You think I had a choice? I think we all did. And too many of us chose wrong. That stung. Alan could see it in Reed's eyes. But he didn't take it back. I'm not trying to destroy the army, Alan continued. But I won't let them use our blood to paint lies. Reed leaned back, folding his arms. There's a man I know. Used to be a war correspondent. Got banned from reporting frontline stories because he printed something the brass didn't like. But he still gets mail, real mail. From real soldiers. Alan's heart skipped. You think he'd print it? If he believes it. Reed pulled out a slip of paper. Scribbled on it was a name and address in London, and the words, eyes open, voice louder. Alan took it carefully. Why are you helping me? Reed met his eyes. Because someone helped me once. And I didn't listen. The next morning, Alan slipped the letter, 22 pages of raw, blistering truth, into an envelope. He addressed it, sealed it, and handed it off to a supply runner headed to the mainland. A kid barely old enough to shave. Just make sure it gets there, Alan said. The kid gave a shaky nod and disappeared down the road. Alan returned to his bunk, knowing full well what he'd done, and knowing full well what might come next. By nightfall, 2 men in suits arrived at camp, not soldiers, not even officers, bureau men. They asked for Private Cooper. No smiles, no questions. Just a summons. Reed caught Alan before he went. If they try to disappear you, he said. Don't let them. Alan smirked. I've already died once. I've got nothing left to lose. As he walked into the command tent, he felt something strange, not fear, not regret. It was fire, burning slow and steady in his chest. The truth was out now, and truth had a habit of echoing, no matter how deep they tried to bury it. The tent smelled like old cigars and damp wool. Alan stood across the table from the 2 men in suits, both of them clean-shaven, expressionless, and so calm it felt rehearsed. One wore a brown trench coat, the other a navy blue tie. Neither had introduced themselves. That was the first sign this wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a warning. The one in the tie spoke first. You're Alan Cooper. Private 1st Canadian Infantry. Alan didn't answer. He just stared. According to your record, the man continued, you were declared killed in action at Dieppe. Alan shrugged. Guess someone was wrong. The man in the trench coat leaned forward slightly. Then maybe someone else was wrong when they said you've been spreading unauthorized accounts of military operations. Alan narrowed his eyes. You mean the truth? The man in the tie offered a thin, empty smile. Private Cooper, you're not a journalist. You're not an officer. You're not cleared for strategic intelligence. What gives you the right to distribute false narratives? False? Alan snapped. You want to talk false? Try telling 900 mothers that their sons died for a test run. There was a beat of silence. Then Trenchcoat spoke. Again, calm, measured, dangerous. You're angry, understandable, but anger clouds judgment. You're one man with a story, an unconfirmed one. There are bigger things at stake. The entire future of this war, for instance. Alan leaned forward, voice low. If the future of this war depends on burying the truth, then maybe we already lost. That shut them up for a second, but only a second. The man in the tie stood and walked slowly around the table, stopping just behind Alan. You're young, Private. You have a future, or at least you did. Right now, we're offering you a choice. Quiet down, go back to your unit and forget all about this report. Or, Alan turned to face him. Or what? He didn't say it, he didn't have to. Consider this a courtesy, Trenchcoat said. You get one warning. There won't be a second. Alan left the tent with the sound of those words echoing in his ears. Back at the barracks, the mood had shifted. The other Dieppe men were waiting for him. Silent, tense. Carver stepped forward. They took your letter, didn't they? Alan shook his head. No. I sent another copy. He pulled a second envelope from inside his jacket, the original draft, the one he'd written before copying it by hand for the courier. I had a feeling, he said. They might intercept the first. Carver grinned, half impressed. Where's this one going? To the man Reed told me about, Alan said. He's not afraid of the truth. That night, under cover of darkness, the second letter was slipped into the hands of a transport officer headed to London. No fanfare, no drama, just quiet rebellion. Days passed, nothing came back, no headlines, no letters, no sign that anyone in the outside world had even heard. But the tension inside the camp was growing. Every move Alan made, he felt eyes on him. Some soldiers were keeping their distance. Others were drawing closer. A few brave souls, mostly Dieppe survivors, began asking to read the full letter themselves. Alan let them. He watched their faces as they read, saw the same flicker of recognition, rage, grief. They'd all been used, and now they weren't just angry. They were ready. Then one morning something changed. A man in uniform, British officer, major's rank, arrived in camp with a newspaper folded under his arm. He didn't speak to anyone, just walked straight toward the Dieppe barracks, dropped the paper on Alan's bunk, and walked away. Alan stared at the front page. There, on the cover of the Daily Herald, in bold letters, Dieppe, the raid that was never meant to win. His hands trembled as he read the first paragraph. It was his story, his words, not all of it. Just enough, sanitized, edited, but the heart of it, the betrayal, the missteps, the buried cost, it was there. The truth had broken through. Carver read over his shoulder, then let out a low whistle. Looks like someone listened. Alan didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just sat there silent, staring at the paper like it was a gravestone, because he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning, and now the real war had started. They came for him at dawn. No sirens, no shouting. Just two soldiers in full uniform, flanked by a third in a grey overcoat. Alan had barely gotten his boots on before they were in the doorway. "Private Cooper," the one in front said, voice stiff with formality. "You're to come with us, immediately. No explanation. No time to ask questions." Alan glanced around the barracks. Carver was already standing, fists clenched, ready to move. "Don't," Alan muttered under his breath. "Let's not give them a reason." The grey-coated officer watched them both. Eyes cold, calculating, Alan followed the men out into the bitter morning air. The camp was quiet, almost too quiet. Even the mess line wasn't moving. Soldiers just stood there, pretending not to look, but Alan could feel their stares. Whispers were already racing faster than orders. They led him not to the usual command tent, but to a military police office on the far end of camp, one Alan hadn't even realized existed. Inside, the room was bare except for a desk, 2 chairs, and a single dull light bulb swinging gently from the ceiling. The officer gestured. "Sit," Alan did. Across from him, a man walked in wearing no rank at all. Civilian suit, clean-shaven, smiling in that smug way that wasn't meant to comfort, just to remind you who had the power. "I've read your little essay," the man said, dropping a folder on the desk. "Brave work. Misguided but brave." Alan didn't respond. The man opened the folder, flipping to a page. "You believe this raid was a setup, that your men were knowingly sacrificed, that it was never meant to succeed. Correct?" Alan's jaw tightened. "I don't believe it." "I know it." The man tilted his head. "And what exactly do you think printing that in a newspaper accomplishes? You think the Germans didn't read that too? You think you've done your country a favor?" "I didn't write it for the enemy," Alan said. "I wrote it for the truth," the man chuckled softly. "And truth wins wars, does it?" Alan leaned forward. "Truth is the only thing that survives after." That wiped the smile from the man's face. He closed the folder. "You've made yourself a problem, Private Cooper, and this army doesn't tolerate problems. So here's what's going to happen." He slid a paper across the desk, 2 sheets typed neatly, clipped at the corner. A formal retraction. "You sign it, we reassign you to a transport unit. Out of combat, out of headlines. You finish your service quietly, with dignity." Alan glanced down. The paper blamed a severe head injury for his account of Dieppe, labeled it confused, traumatic recollection, discredited the article, dismissed his version of events entirely. "You want me to lie?" Alan said flatly. "No," the man said. "I want you to let go." Alan stood slowly, hands clenched. "You buried us once. I won't help you do it again." For a moment the man said nothing. Then his tone changed. "Fine, but understand this. You won't be a hero. You'll be a footnote, a ghost. We'll scrub your name off every wall and record." Alan stared him dead in the eye. "Then I'll carve it into the damn stone myself." He was escorted back to the barracks 2 hours later. No charges, no court-martial. Not yet, but everyone knew what it meant. They were trying to break him without making a martyr out of him. Too late. That night, when Alan returned, Carver handed him another paper. This one passed around the camp like a secret flame, a clipped article from a Dutch underground paper, translated from the original French. Canadian soldier claims Dieppe was sacrifice, not strategy. Alan's words, his fire, had already crossed borders, and with it, something stirred among the other survivors. Something dangerous. They weren't alone anymore. The ghosts were waking up. Rain poured the morning Alan Cooper disappeared. By then, most of the camp had heard, not just about the article, but about the retraction he refused to sign, the interrogation, and the quiet threats dressed in polished shoes. The story had grown teeth, and command wasn't just nervous anymore. They were furious. Carver found Alan sitting under the half-collapsed canopy behind the motor pool, hunched over a metal crate, soaked to the bone, and writing furiously in a field notebook. "They're not going to let you walk away." "You know," Carver said. Alan didn't look up. "I'm not planning to. You should run, while you still can. Take one of the trucks, make it to a port. Change your name, disappear." Alan finally stopped writing, closed the book slowly. "And then what?" he asked. "Spend the rest of my life pretending this didn't happen?" Carver said nothing, because deep down, he knew Alan wasn't built for silence. Alan stood, handed Carver the notebook. "If they come for me, make sure this gets out. There's a radio guy in London, goes by Jack Thorne, underground voice, pirate station. Find him. He'll know what to do." Carver took it, eyes heavy. "And you?" Alan looked out over the field, the soldiers marching, shouting, training, still trapped in the great machinery of war. "I'm going to remind them who they're fighting for." He marched straight into the officer's tent 15 minutes later. No appointment, no knock. 3 men stood inside, including the same intelligence officer from before. Grey-coated and venom-eyed. "You again," the man sneered. Alan dropped a folded piece of paper onto the desk. "What's this?" One of the officers asked. "A speech," Alan said. "You've lost your mind." Alan stepped forward. "No, I've just remembered what I came here to fight for." The next morning, a crowd formed near the supply trucks. Word had spread, like wildfire in a dry forest. They didn't know why they were gathering, only that Cooper had demanded it. Alan stood atop a loading crate, rain falling on his shoulders, face pale but set with purpose. Dozens of soldiers, some survivors, some fresh recruits, stared up at him, waiting. He took a breath. "My name's Private Alan Cooper. I was declared dead at Dieppe. They wrote my name on a list and buried me with 900 others, without a funeral, without truth, without honor." Murmurs began. I came back and found silence. I found lies. They called it a strategic success. They called it necessary. But what they didn't call it was what it really was. He paused. A sacrifice. The rain kept falling. They knew. They knew we wouldn't make it off that beach. They sent us anyway, to test ideas, to measure blood like it was ammunition. And now they want us to forget, to disappear. He held up the soaked paper. "I won't." Somewhere in the crowd, someone yelled, "We're with you, Cooper." Then another, and just like that, the dam cracked, but so did the sky. Sirens blared, military police rushed in. The officers ordered the crowd to disperse, but no one moved. Alan stood tall as the MPs surrounded him. One grabbed his arm, shoved him down. But before they could drag him off, someone else stepped forward. Carver, then a second soldier, then 5, then a dozen. They didn't attack. They didn't shout. They just stood there, together, unmoving, a silent wall. And for the first time since Dieppe, Alan realized something. They couldn't bury the truth, because it was standing right in front of them. Alan was thrown in confinement that evening. No trial, no official charges. Just locked away, quietly hidden. But it was already too late. Carver had escaped the base that night with the notebook. It made its way to London, into the hands of Jack Thorne, onto the airwaves. Across rooftops and radios, in crackling voices that carried across oceans. We were sacrificed, but we are not silent. The name Alan Cooper became more than just a name. It became a shadow in the corridors of power, a ghost they couldn't erase, a whisper that wouldn't stop growing, and long after the war ended, after Normandy, after victory, after medals and memorials, a small plaque was placed at the Dieppe beach by a group of unnamed veterans. It read, "In memory of those who were sent without warning, fought without chance and died without truth." This was not a mistake. It was a lesson paid in blood. Alan Cooper's body was never found, but his voice never stopped echoing.